The solicitor's office smelled of furniture polish and old radiators, and Winifred Ashcombe sat in the hard chair by the window because it was the one nobody else wanted, and watched her brother divide up their grandmother's life. She was 71 years old. She had spent 40 of those years bent over seed trays and herbarium sheets in 3 countries, and her hands, folded now in her lap, were a botanist's hands, brown-spotted, strong in the thumb. A permanent shadow of soil worked so deep into the creases that no amount of scrubbing had ever fully lifted it. She kept them still. She had learned, over a long life of being underestimated, that stillness was mistaken for weakness by people who had never had to be patient about anything, and that this mistake was frequently useful. Across the table, her brother Rupert was not still. Rupert was never still. He had their grandmother's papers spread in front of him in the manner of a man laying out a winning hand, and his wife, Camilla, sat at his elbow in a coat that cost more than Freddie's car, nodding at each document as though she'd read it, which she had not. "It's really very straightforward," Rupert was saying to the solicitor, a tired man named Mr. Paget who had clearly said the word however several times already and been rolled over each time. "Mother left the estate to be divided according to need and contribution. Now, Camilla and I have carried this family for a decade. The house, the land, the whatever's in the accounts, it comes to us. Winifred has her little pension and her plants." He said plants the way another man might say gambling debts. "She doesn't need the burden of a 14-acre property she can barely walk across." "I can walk across it perfectly well," Freddie said. It was the first thing she'd said in 20 minutes, and Rupert blinked at the sound of her voice the way people did, surprised, always, that she had won. "You know what I mean," he said. "I don't think I do, actually." She kept her voice mild. The mildness was not a performance, she genuinely felt mild. She had buried a husband and 2 dear friends and a great many hopes over 7 decades, and she had discovered that very little was worth raising her voice over, and that the things which were worth it were almost never the things happening in rooms like this. "But go on. You were dividing up Gran's life. Don't let me stop you." Camilla's mouth thinned. "There's no need to be like that, Winifred. Nobody's dividing anything up. We're honoring her wishes." "Her wishes?" Freddie turned to Mr. Paget. "Did she leave a letter of wishes, an actual one in her hand?" Paget shifted. "There is a memorandum, not witnessed as a formal codicil, so its legal weight is, limited. But it does express certain intentions." "And what does it say about the garden?" The room went very slightly quiet, the way a room does when someone asks about the one thing everybody has agreed not to mention. Because that was the part nobody wanted, not the house, which was cold and damp and needed a roof. And certainly not the garden, which was 14 acres of what Rupert called wilderness and Camilla called an eyesore, and the estate agent's preliminary note had called significant clearance costs. The great ruined Victorian glasshouse with its cracked panes and its choking vines, the walled beds gone to bramble, the whole vast green wreck of the place their grandmother Constance had tended alone for 50 years and refused, to the fury of her family, to ever sell, ever develop, ever tidy. "The memorandum," Paget said carefully, "asks that the garden and its contents pass to Winifred. Specifically. It's quite emphatic on the point, actually. It's the only specific bequest in the document. Everything else is left to your discretion as executors, but the garden it names to your sister by name, and it, he adjusted his glasses, it underlines the word contents 3 times. Rupert laughed. "Well, there you are, she can have the brambles." "Rupert," Camilla put a hand on his arm, not to stop him, Freddie saw, but to steer. Camilla was the cleverer of the 2, which was not a high bar, but it was worth noting. "Winifred, darling, of course you must have the garden if it means something to you. It clearly did to Constance. We wouldn't dream of it otherwise." She smiled, warm as a radiator that isn't on. "The house and the estate we'll manage since somebody has to, and you shall have your grandmother's garden and all its contents." A small pause on the word, an echo of the underlining, and Freddie understood in that pause that Camilla had already looked. Already been out there, already walked the wreck of it with a torch, and satisfied herself that whatever contents meant, it meant nothing worth the fight. Brambles, broken glass, a dead woman's hobby. That's settled then, Rupert said, relieved, gathering his papers. Winifred gets the garden, we'll deal with the rest. Paget, you'll draw it up. And honestly, he stood, buttoning his coat, pleased with his own generosity now, expansive with it, it's the right outcome. She always did love mucking about out there with Mother. Two of them up to their elbows in muck while the rest of us got on with the real world. He looked at his sister with something that was almost, but not quite, fondness. You never did understand money, Fred. Never wanted to. I've always rather admired it in a way, restful not to want things. Yes, Freddie said, I've always found it very restful. She let them go. She stayed in the hard chair by the window while Rupert and Camilla swept out into the car park to their large German car, and she watched Mr. Paget gather the papers with the resigned care of a man who has watched a great many families do a great many things to each other across that table. Mrs. Ashcombe, he said when they were alone, I should say the memorandum isn't binding if you felt the division was unfair. The house, the accounts, a court might well. I don't want the house, Freddie said, or the accounts. No. No, she stood slowly, her knees telling her the weather was turning, and picked up her old canvas bag. I want the garden and its contents. She smiled at him, and it was a real smile, the first one of the afternoon, and Mr. Paget would find himself thinking about it later that evening without quite knowing why. My brother thinks he's given me the bramble patch and kept the fortune. Let him think it. It's restful. She walked out into the gray afternoon. She did not tell Mr. Paget what she knew. She did not tell anyone. But she had spent 40 years as a taxonomist, which is the science of knowing precisely what a thing is when everyone around you is content with a vague idea of it. And she had known her grandmother Constance for the whole of her own life, and she knew 3 things that Rupert and Camilla did not. She knew that Constance Ashcombe had not spent 50 years alone in that glasshouse growing brambles. She knew what a Victorian seed house was actually for. And she knew, because she was the only living person Constance had ever told, that somewhere under the choked and ruined benches of that great green wreck, in a place her grandmother had described to her once, 20 years ago, in a voice gone low and careful, there was a locked cast-iron seed vault that had not been opened since 1961. What Freddie did not yet know, what nobody knew, what would not surface until a builder's boot went through a rotten floorboard 11 days later, was that Constance had hidden 2 fortunes in that garden. One of them was money, 1.9 million pounds of it, in a strongbox under the potting shed, saved and hidden across a lifetime for reasons of her own. The builder's name was Danny O'Kay, AFOR, and he put his boot through the potting shed floor on a Tuesday morning that had started ordinarily and did not stay that way. He'd been hired by Rupert, which was the first thing Freddie found interesting when she heard about it, that her brother had sent a man onto her land, the land that was legally hers now, without a word to her. But Rupert had always treated ownership as a thing that belonged to whoever behaved as though it did, and Camilla had wanted the outbuildings assessed for what she called residual value before. Presumably, the whole green wreck was flattened. So Danny had come with a clipboard and a damp meter to price up the demolition of a dead woman's garden, and instead his foot had gone through a board soft with 50 years of rot, and when he'd knelt to see what he'd broken, the torch on his phone had caught the dull gray corner of a strongbox. He was, it turned out, an honest man. This mattered a great deal to everything that followed, though nobody could have known it that morning. He did not open the box and pocket what was in it. He did not ring Rupert, who had hired him. He looked at the box, and he looked at the little hand-written label wired to its handle, property of W. Ashcombe. Please see Winifred, in an old woman's careful copperplate, and Danny Ockhaffer, who had a grandmother of his own, went and found out who Winifred was, and rang her instead. "There's a box," he said on the phone, sounding uncertain about the whole thing, "under the floor of the little shed. You're the lady who owned this place. She left a label on it with your name. Says to see you. I haven't touched it, only I put my foot through the boards. I'm sorry about the boards. I didn't want to ring the fella who hired me. Felt wrong. It's got your name on it." Freddie was very quiet for a moment. "Mr. Ashcombe," she said, "would you do something for me? Would you leave the box exactly where it is and photograph the label and the boards and the hole before anyone else sees it? And then would you telephone a solicitor named Paget, whose number I'll give you, and tell him precisely what you told me so that it's on a record that isn't mine? And then, only then, would you wait for me. I'll drive over. It'll take me 40 minutes. Don't let my brother onto the property before I get there." "He's already rung twice this morning," Danny said, "wanting the assessment." "Then don't answer," said Freddie, "and I'll be as quick as I can." She was not quick, because her knees would not let her be, but she was thorough, which was better. By the time she arrived, old estate car, mud on the sills, a canvas bag on the passenger seat. Danny had done exactly as she'd asked, and there were time-stamped photographs, and Mr. Paget had a note, and the chain of the thing was clean. This would matter later. Almost everything Freddie did in the first hour of knowing about that box would matter later, because Freddie had spent 40 years in a discipline where the specimen is worthless without its provenance, where a rare seed in an unlabeled envelope is just a seed, but the same seed with its collection data intact can rewrite a map, and she treated the strongbox the way she'd treat a type specimen. Document first. Establish where it came from and who touched it and when. The value comes after. They opened it together, she and Danny, in the gray light through the broken shed roof, with Danny's phone filming because she'd asked him to. It was money. Old notes and newer ones, banded and boxed and wrapped in oilcloth against the damp, decades of it, and a ledger in Constance's hand recording each sum and its date, but never, Freddie noted, its source. Later, when it was counted properly under Paget's eye, it came to £1,940,000. Danny sat back on his heels and said a word Freddie chose not to hear. "Sorry," he said. "Sorry, it's just is that yours? Is that actually yours?" "It appears to be." Freddie looked at the money without much expression. It was a great deal of money, and it changed a number of practical things, and she was not unmoved by it. But she was also, underneath, doing arithmetic of a different kind, because a woman does not save nearly £2 million in cash across a lifetime and hide it under a shed for the pleasure of the thing. Constance had been hiding it from something. And a woman who hides money that carefully, who records the sums but never the sources, is a woman who did not want anyone ever to be able to ask where it came from. One of them was money, Freddie thought, looking at it, and it's the smaller one. Because the strongbox was not what her grandmother had told her about 20 years ago, in that low, careful voice. Constance had never once mentioned money. What Constance had told her about was the vault. The cast-iron seed vault, sealed since 1961, somewhere under the great glasshouse, and the strongbox, for all its heft, was in the potting shed, a good 60 yards from the glasshouse, in the wrong building entirely. Which meant there were two hiding places, and Freddie had just found the decoy. She had time to think exactly that thought, and no more, before she heard the car. She knew the engine. Everyone in the family knew the engine. Rupert had chosen it to be known by. It came up the rutted drive too fast, throwing gravel, and stopped hard by the glasshouse, and Rupert got out already talking. Camilla a half-step behind him in Wellingtons that had never seen mud, and the sight of Freddie kneeling by an open strongbox full of banded cash stopped both of them as cleanly as a wall. There was a silence you could have planted seedlings in. "What," said Rupert, "is that?" "It's a strongbox," said Freddie. "Mr. Ashcombe found it under the potting shed floor when the boards gave way. It has my name on it. Gran left it to me. Would you like to see the label?" She held up her phone with the photograph of the copperplate on it. Property of W. Ashcombe. Please see Winifred. It's rather clear. Camilla recovered first. Camilla always recovered first. Freddie watched her do the sum, watched the coat, the Wellingtons, the whole assembled disdain of her reorganize itself in real time around a new and enormous fact, and watched her land, with impressive speed, on the position that would serve her best. "Well," Camilla said warmly, "thank goodness Danny had the sense to find you. Winifred, this is wonderful. Isn't it, Rupert? This must be Constance's savings all these years, bless her. She was always so careful. Of course it forms part of the estate, so we'll need to." "It doesn't though," said Freddie. "I'm sorry." "Form part of the estate." Freddie stood, slowly, hand on the shed frame, and brushed the dirt from her knees. "It was in the garden, inside the potting shed, which is a structure within the garden. And the garden and its contents passed to me by name, underlined 3 times. You were quite insistent on it, Camilla, only 11 days ago in Mr. Paget's office. You shall have your grandmother's garden and all its contents. I remember it clearly. I imagine Mr. Paget does too. He was taking a note." The warmth went out of Camilla's face like heat out of a pan lifted off the ring. "That is not," Rupert began. "That is not what the contents meant. The pots, Winifred, the tools, the nobody meant." "It meant the contents," said Freddie. "It's not a word with a great deal of give in it. That's why I like it." And here Freddie watched something happen that she had seen many times in a long life and never enjoyed. She watched 2 people who had, 11 days ago, laughed at her for not understanding money, realize all at once that she understood it perfectly well, and had simply never thought it worth wanting until it was worth having, and had worse, far worse, unforgivably, outlawyered them with their own generous, contemptuous words. Rupert's face went a color she associated with high blood pressure. "We'll contest it," he said. "The memorandum's not binding. Paget said so himself. It's not a proper codicil, it's a note, a sentimental note. No court in the country is going to hand £2 million to He stopped himself, but not soon enough, and the end of the sentence stood in the cold air unsaid. "To a dotty old woman who plays with plants." "To a what, Rupert?" Freddie asked quite gently. He didn't answer. "You may certainly contest it," Freddie went on. "That's your right. I'd only mention 2 things before you spend money on it. The first is that the money was found by a builder you hired and sent onto my land without my knowledge, and that he chose, on his own judgment, to ring me rather than you, which a court will find interesting, when it wonders who expected to find what. And the second," she picked up her canvas bag, and settled the strap on her shoulder, and looked at her brother and his wife with the flat, patient, unarguable attention of a woman reading a specimen label. "The second is that you're standing about arguing over a strongbox in a potting shed, and you haven't once, in 11 days, asked yourselves why Constance underlined the word contents 3 times for a garden you were certain was worthless. You think you've just watched me win the prize." She turned toward the great ruined glasshouse behind them, its cracked panes catching the gray light, its dark green interior choked and waiting. "You've watched me find the wrapping paper." She walked past them, toward the glasshouse, and neither of them followed, because neither of them yet understood that there was anywhere to follow her to. Danny Okafor, standing by the shed with his clipboard forgotten in his hand, watched the old woman go, and thought he'd tell his wife this that evening, not quite able to explain it, that he had never in his life seen anyone walk toward a ruin the way she did, like it was the most valuable building in England. He didn't know yet that, to the right people, it was about to become exactly that. The glasshouse door had not been opened in a long time, and it fought her. Freddie set her shoulder to it, the low, careful lean of a woman who knows exactly how much force her body will lend her and not an ounce more, and the swollen frame gave with a groan, and 50 years of held air came out to meet her. Green air, wet and cold and thick with the smell of leaf mold and rust and something sweeter underneath, the particular perfume of a place where things have been growing and dying and growing again with nobody watching. Most people would have smelled decay. Freddie smelled a working glasshouse that had simply been left to run wild, which is a different thing entirely, and her chest did something complicated, because the last time she had stood in this doorway her grandmother had been alive beside her. She went in alone. Rupert and Camilla had gone, driven off in a spray of gravel and unfinished threats, off to find a solicitor who would tell them what they wanted to hear about non-binding memoranda. And Danny had gone back to his van to ring his own firm, and she suspected, to sit down for a while, because a man does not find nearly £2 million under a shed before lunch and carry on as though he hasn't. So it was just Freddie and the green wreck, and 40 years of training that came up through her hands the moment she stepped inside. Because she was reading it. She couldn't help it. It was what she was. Most people walking into that ruin would have seen chaos, a jungle, a mess, benches collapsed under bramble, the great central bed a riot of self-seeded green. Freddie saw a collection. Neglected, yes, run to seed for half a century. But underneath the wildness, the bones of the thing were still there, and the bones told a story that made the hair rise on her arms. Because these were not ordinary plants. She moved down the central aisle slowly, naming as she went, the old taxonomist's litany running under her breath, not the common names but the true ones, genus and species, the words that pin a living thing to its precise place in the order of the world. And what she was naming, again and again, were things that had no business being alive in a Sussex glasshouse in the 21st century. A woody old survivor sprawled against the back wall that she was fairly sure she'd need a flower, she'd need to key it out properly, but she was fairly sure had been declared extinct in the wild in the 1980s. A whole bed of a low, gray-leaved thing that existed, as far as the world's botanical institutions were concerned, only as pressed and dead specimens in 3 herbaria. Constance had not been growing brambles. Constance had been running, alone in secret, for 50 years, one of the most extraordinary living collections of lost plants that Freddie had ever stood inside, and Freddie had stood inside a great many. Oh, Gran, she thought, what did you do? And then at the far end, past the collapsed benches, half hidden behind a curtain of ivy grown thick as a hedge, she found the door in the floor. She'd known it would be there. Constance had described it once, 20 years ago, in that low, careful voice. There's a room under the far end, Freddie, a cold room. My father built it and his father before him. And there's a vault in it that hasn't been opened since '61. And one day it's going to matter very much who opens it, and I'd rather it was you than anyone. Freddie had thought at the time that it was an old woman being romantic about her garden. She had loved Constance too much to hear the warning under the romance. She heard it now. She did not go down that day. Her knees would not do a ladder into a cold cellar, not alone, not with no one knowing where she was, and besides the taxonomist in her again, she wanted it documented, photographed, witnessed, its seals intact and recorded intact before a single thing was disturbed. Provenance, always provenance. So she photographed the door and the floor, and the ivy, and the extraordinary living things all down the aisle, and she went home to her small cottage and her small pension, and she sat up most of the night with her old flora and her hand lens and a growing certainty that turned, somewhere around 3 in the morning, into something close to fear. Because if she was right about even half of what was growing in that glasshouse, then the collection was worth more than the strongbox. Very much more. Not in the vulgar way Rupert would understand. You could not mostly sell these things, and the ones you could sell legally were few, but in the way that mattered to the people who ran the world Freddie had spent her life in. Lost species. Living genetic material thought gone forever. To a seed bank, to a conservation program, to a pharmaceutical botanist, to a nation trying to rebuild a habitat it had destroyed. Some of what was in that glasshouse was, quite literally, irreplaceable. And irreplaceable things attract a particular kind of person. She found out how particular 4 days later, when Julian Harcourt Vane telephoned. She knew the name before he'd finished saying it. Everyone in her world knew the name Harcourt Vane. The Harcourt Vanes were plants the way other dynasties were newspapers or shipping. 4 generations of them, a famous nursery in Cornwall, a family collection of national importance, a foundation, a seat on every committee that mattered, and Julian himself the current head of it. Charming, silver-templed, a fixture of the botanical establishment, a man who had been photographed shaking hands with the sort of people who get plants named after them. He was, by any measure, one of the most respected plantsmen in the country. "Mrs. Ashcombe," he said, and his voice was warm and cultured and entirely at ease. "Forgive the intrusion. My name is Julian Harcourt Vane. I had the very great privilege of corresponding with your grandmother years ago, a remarkable woman, quite remarkable, and I was so terribly sorry to hear of her passing. I wonder if I might come and see you. I gather you've inherited her garden." For days. The money had been found 4 days ago, and it had not, as far as Freddie knew, been in any newspaper. But the news that Winifred Ashcombe had inherited Constance's garden had traveled to Cornwall in 4 days and brought a Harcourt Vane to her telephone. And Freddie, who found patterns for a living, who had spent a career noticing when a thing appears where it has no natural business being, felt the whole shape of the next months arrive at once, the way you feel weather change before the sky does. Someone had been waiting for Constance to die. Not for the money. Nobody outside the family knew about the money. Someone had been waiting patiently across years for the old woman to die and for that glasshouse to change hands, because someone else besides Freddie knew what was growing in it. And now the garden had passed not to Rupert, who would have flattened it and never known what he destroyed, but to Winifred Ashcombe, who had spent 40 years learning the exact and terrible value of a lost plant with its provenance intact. "Mr. Harcourt Vane," Freddie said pleasantly. "How kind. Yes, do come. I'd be very interested to hear about your correspondence with my grandmother." A small pause the length of a breath. "I don't suppose you'd have kept the letters. I do so like to see things in a person's own hand. One learns such a lot from what people write down, and," she added, mild as milk, "from what they don't." There was the briefest silence on the line from Cornwall. Half a second, a quarter. The kind of silence a person makes when they have just realized that the dotty old woman they'd expected to find is reading the label, and that the label is reading them back. "Of course," said Julian Harcourt Vane, smooth as ever. "Of course, I'll bring what I have." He would not bring the letters. Freddie knew that before he'd hung up. Men like Julian Harcourt Vane never brought the letters. That was the whole of what she needed to know about him. For now, that, and the fact that he had come running at the word garden and not the word inheritance, which told her that whatever the Harcourt Vane dynasty wanted from that glasshouse, it was down in the cold room under the ivy, in a cast-iron vault sealed since 1961, and it was worth more to them than nearly £2 million in a box. She put the phone down and looked out of her small window at her small garden, and she was 71 years old and her knees ached, and she was, she realized, not remotely afraid anymore. She was interested. "Right," said Winifred Ashcombe, to the empty room, to her grandmother, to the whole assembled weight of the world that had spent her life deciding she was nobody in particular. "Let's find out what you were so frightened of, Gran. And who?"